current events to talk about with my students is awesome, because most of them, are taking theology because they have to, and this is a Catholic university, and so it doesn't feel relevant. And so I love it when things are relevant, but I sort of agree with Nick that it may be a blip just because everything is a blip now. Like, I just can't. There's been so many things,
Yeah. The evidence on my, and I'll say this and I'll shut up. The evidence that I would point to is that the Biden-Trump polling over the last 2 months has gone from basically an even tie to now Biden's up 12. So it was like even, and then Biden was up like 6 a month ago. He's up like 11 now. And so there are people, for whatever reason, who, I mean, that could be the course of an election and people sort of shifting, but that's a pretty big swing for June, the summer before a national election.
And it's always hard to tell how the American public is reacting to something. And it's your point, Nick, right? Because we are so partisan and so divided. But I think the international reaction to this is somewhat telling. I don't know if you saw the Australian coverage of this. Like Australia had some journalists in the crowd there, and they got beat up, and there was a big deal there. And maybe more importantly, Justin Trudeau's response to this, when they asked him about what he thought about Trump's reaction, and he sat there for 20 seconds. Didn't say anything, like, he just sort of, as he's contemplating this and he knows he has to say something, right? I think that suggests we're in a bigger moment than we may always appreciate, and one in which the American public may be shifting in ways that we're not measuring yet.
Nobody cares what Canadians think.
Also true. Yeah. No,
I say that because Justin's a Canadian.
It's no, the narrative is, I firmly believe that this is, if you want to talk about the difference between Biden and Trump, especially in terms of approval numbers, this is nothing. Like, this is going to be within a percentage point come November. This is the stock market. It means nothing because the narratives have already been built. You either gassed peaceful protesters who were there lawfully before a curfew, or you removed protesters who previously had tried to burn down a church and tagged historical buildings. It was the same group of people who were not going to leave before a curfew was in place, and you took back what you should have taken back. Those are the two narratives at this point. And you will not find many people who are going to look into the nuances of that. I don't think this is going to change. It's every conversation that we've had about anything else especially over the past few months, whether we're talking about COVID or this or foreign affairs or anything, because the right doesn't give a shit about foreign affairs at this point, especially Justin Trudeau, probably highest among most at this point. And the left doesn't care about anything that Trump will or potentially could do right. It doesn't matter. Not that he did anything right, but even the concept of those two concepts can't even enter the wider conversation. This is done. Let's move on.
You're wrong again. And here's why. I mean, I think one, I think this is a big deal, and we can't forget that we're having this conversation in the midst of a pandemic.
No, we're not. It's done.
Crisis. The pandemic's over. All of these things. This is, it didn't matter who your president was. It would be incredibly difficult to win re-election in this world. And I don't know. I in some ways this could have been a softball where he could have responded in that way in which George W. Bush did after 9/11. I don't know if we saw, but his press secretary today was comparing Trump to Churchill, after the bombings and George W. Bush, and that's clearly not the case. He's not embracing that role, and I think these things are going to linger and just kind of wear people down to say, I don't care who's running against him. I'm tired of this stuff.
I guess we'll see.
Apparently, while we have had this conversation, Jim Mattis has broken his silence, who talked about how he was going to, he would know the time to speak up.
Former Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
What did he say,
apparently denounced Trump and described him as a threat to the Constitution. So we'll have that to talk about next week.
That sounds traitorous. I don't trust him. Yeah.
That's interesting because there was criticism of Esper today for not resigning, and there was this really interesting conversation about whether it's better to resign, what Mattis did, or to give a press conference and have a more public rebuke. But that's important that Mattis weighed in, and we've been arguing for a long time that more of those former officials should have said so.
That's where I think the rhetoric around launching, I mean, we haven't talked that much about it, but what went along with all of this stuff with Trump walking over to the church was this rhetoric about unleashing the military on the American people, essentially, if necessary. I think that's, for military people, that crosses a line that's held sacred.
Yeah.
Maybe more so than the American public. Some of the polls
Right.
have suggested that the American public is okay with that, but not so much the military. Should we kick around this concept of law and order, or do we got to wrap up, Nick?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like this conversation should probably go a little bit longer than normal.
Okay. So Justin, you started us off talking about this idea of law and order and its connection to religion, and I guess I'm curious whether evangelicals, whether that combination of him holding the Bible and claiming to be the law and order president, does that work for that community? Is that message strong enough where they look the other way on all these other issues?
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine it being strong enough because as I said, there's been this history of really coming to identify, I guess, the sovereignty of God with the sovereignty of the presidency and the nation state, at least when it's a Republican president. So yeah, I do think that is going to be effective. I mean, what's interesting is that, there's a lot of, when we're talking about 81% of evangelical Christians or whatever, we're talking about a lot of white people, a lot of white Christians that voted for Trump in the 2016 election. And in a way, it's almost surprising that it wasn't more. Now that we've seen evangelicalism revealed in the light of this presidency, so yeah, there may be additional resistance in this election, but I do think that the idea of, for white people, for white Christians in particular, the idea of American exceptionalism is very difficult to let go of, and so there's this notion that and that exceptionalism has a lot to do with the benefits that accrue to white people in a country that's been shaped by white supremacy over the course of its history. And so even though it's so simple, I mean, in the words of their Savior Jesus, that if the Sabbath is hurting God's creatures, you change it. In other words, if any human-made order is hurting those whom God has created to flourish, and God has created all persons to flourish. I mean, God is the original all lives matter, but the problem is all lives matter to God. They don't to us, right? And so how God's agenda gets worked out in the context of any status quo in which some count for less than others is that God is partisan on behalf of the marginalized. And in order to accept that, you also have to accept that it is possible for America as God's chosen nation to need to change. And I mean, there's a social gospel theologian, Walter Rauschenbusch, who talks about, kind of gave this like analysis of he kind of imagined the centuries all hanging out together, and that the and this was around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And he kind of imagined previous centuries, they would, like the 17th century would be hanging out with the 16th century or whatever. And they'd all get together every 100 years and they would kind of like shit on each other, And so some of them would go like, well, I did this and that, right? And I did these amazing things. And, aren't I great? And the other ones would have to criticize them, because in the present, it's very hard to see that your present moment needs to be, especially if you're the one who, by and large, benefits from current arrangements. And so the hard thing to do is not just to look back in the past and see, well, wow, we were so wrong in the 50s, or we were so wrong in the 80s or whatever, but actually to look at the present moment and say, what will future generations look back and say, you were forsaking your not only your political obligations, but your sacred obligations. And it's very different. There are some evangelicals that have really been convinced that this order is the only possible. And, so there's also an existential reason that that's terrifying, right? Is that life is uncertain and history is change. And that's just fundamentally what it means to exist in time as a human being. And so that means that we're always anxious. Anxiety is just the mood of our lives, according to Soren Kierkegaard, who's one of my favorite philosophers and theologians. And so therefore, any order, especially one that you don't feel, asks you really to give up that much, any order feels like a raft in the storm of chaos of existence. And so the whole idea of like, what if this thing would change, right, is terrifying. But if you're the person who's suffering anguish as a result of the layout of that order, then you hear the words of the prophets and the words of Jesus as not abrasive, but as energizing and hopeful. And right now, white evangelicals are not there yet. I do see, I'll just talk about my own city. In Louisville, there is this movement of, Empower West, it's called. And it's basically a bunch of congregations, because as Martin Luther King used to talk about all the time, he was very disappointed that the most segregated hour of the week in America was still, Sunday morning, 10 to 11 or whatever the time was, right? And people don't worship together.
That's early. Can we go later?
Yeah, 11 to 12, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So some church leaders here in Louisville have made significant efforts in about the last 5 years to bridge the 9th Street divide, basically, at least for people of faith. And so there's been this citywide book club. And you've got these white congregations. Some of them are, a lot of the ones that buy into this, right? They're kind of the progressive white congregations. They love to think of themselves as, hashtag BLM, right? But in fact, they're really, really, milk white congregations. But anyway, so they're getting together with their African-American neighbors in the city and reading these books, some of them really challenging books, like Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told. I don't know if you guys know about that book. Carol Anderson, White Rage. These are just some of the recent, and they're tough, and tough at least for people that aren't used to talking about race, or only used to talking about race in the kind of sanitized way that we do on our social media platforms and stuff. And what's happened there is it has all of a sudden become, in this city, imperative upon predominantly white churches to practice kind of uncomfortable thinking about their own complicity and their inheritance of racist systems. And so I do think that there is a possibility for sure of evangelicals even being part of that. And that, I have students who go to a big mega church in town. And I won't name it because it's a big place, and it is not, it's a very kind of conservative evangelical congregation. But even there, they report to me. They always want to know if I agree with their pastor or whatever, right? When they're hearing stuff in class, and I never tell them yes or no. I'm like, oh, that's interesting, whatever. But even there, I'm seeing movement, at least on questions of, if we claim to represent this person, then we cannot ignore these types of moral questions. So yeah, I do think that holding to order, just as the American status quo, is at risk in a way that is kind of interesting and possibly signals a constructive future for evangelical Christianity. But like I said, I'm still an outsider to that world. Myself, so it's not like I'm there on Sunday mornings, right? My church is very, lefty progressive. Yeah,
it's a really interesting point, because evangelical Christians were largely apolitical until the late 20th to like the 1970s and 80s, and kind of jumped on board with the abortion issue and whatnot. And when you look at in a comparative perspective, the role of religion in politics around the world, there's this tension at play where, as churches or as religious groups gain access to power, there are benefits to that, right? And that you can pass policies and whatever, but there are also drawbacks, as you pointed out earlier in this podcast. You can't be critical. It's harder to sort of speak for the people. But you have evangelical Christianity, which has sort of attained this position of power in American politics for 40 years. And so change is a threat to that, right? So it puts the evangelical community in this difficult position of, maybe you don't agree with Trump, but the alternative, which is in some way losing power, is threatening, which is where I think the sort of law and order can mean something much deeper to a sort of Christian community than, just a like the police need to be out there sort of way.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I do also, just to tack one more thing onto that, as far as like the shifts in evangelicalism, it is undeniable that women are increasingly significant theological influences in the evangelical world. And they're often women who start out as like bloggers and, that are very much insiders to the evangelical tradition, but who have become deeply critical of their upbringing and also have therefore provided a refuge for many evangelicals who have felt like they have to just leave their church in order to still be Christian. And now those women are often chastised and criticized by the gatekeepers of evangelical theological power. Leaders of really patriarchal denominations and stuff. But nonetheless, I mean, their books sell a lot of copies, and women are kicking ass and some of them are ex-evangelicals, they would call themselves that, but they are really kicking ass in that world. And I've seen that influence of those people on members of my own family who are evangelicals, who have read these books and have just gone, like, they've started to say, not necessarily change their doctrinal positions on anything, but they started to say, why would this loving God tell me that I have to be opposed to these people and their pain my own grandmother, who's, in her 90s. I was, and now it's not necessarily because she was reading these theologians, but, I was visiting with her a couple of years ago, and she had a newspaper there, and she doesn't hear too well. And, so I'm yelling at her, what's going on in my day and stuff. And she's got this newspaper there, and it's open to the front page is visible. And it's about the Pride Parade that had happened in her city, the day before. And she picks it up and she kind of points to this story. And I just thought, oh boy, what's about to happen right in this conversation? And she goes, well, there are people too. Right? And I thought, my goodness, like, that was not what I was expecting. But also, like, from her perspective, it's not necessarily about, I think in a way, it's probably, she's been an independent woman. My grandfather died a long time ago. And so she's done her own thinking. And there's lots of that going on in the evangelical church. And I think it is attributable to the liberation of women thinkers. And so it doesn't mean they're losing their faith or anything, right? It just means that it's changing. The shape of it is changing.
Well, that's got to be scary to the Trump administration, right? Because they have to think that their reelection strategy and their response to the week's events really is going to center not on religion, but on this idea of law and order and authoritarianism, this idea that you follow the way the political position is, not where the religious doctrine is. And I'm not sure where that's all going to shake out.
All right. So here's the opposing perspective. So, realistically, the conversation is almost identical in a lot of instances on the left. And I highly encourage people to read The New Right by Michael Malice, avowed anarchist and provocateur. Hilarious guy, really insightful. He came up with this concept, which he refers to as the evangelical left, which realistically is pretty much the dogmatic principles that the right used to advance more so than they do right now, or used to be ascribed to the right, especially the evangelical right, is equally as pronounced, and if not more pronounced, in modern society on the left, where it doesn't operate under the guise of religion. It operates under the guise of political norms and institutions and normal behavior, quote unquote, as put out there by the people who put the message out there, mainly governmental officials and the media and the entertainment industry more than anything, where if you don't ascribe to a particular viewpoint, you are ostracized from that community and made to you can't operate, or you're deemed a heretic if you don't evince that particular worldview. And as we talk about evangelical Christians, where they have this, they're supposedly having this reckoning with how they operate and the fundamental tenets of their religion and what that means for how they behave in a relatively secular society, that conversation also should be happening on the left. But most of the people, especially on the right, feel that the left, especially the evangelical left as it's conceived of, has been in power, including during conservative administrations, more so than actual conservative Americans have, who feel ostracized. And that's how we get 2016 and Trump and this upswell of what is deemed now, radical conservative thought. I think it's an interesting discussion to have, because we chastise evangelicals on the right from a religious perspective, but the same thing can absolutely be attributed to people on the left. But if you do that, you are deemed a heretic across mainstream media and social media, because you don't ascribe to the norms that the political sphere and political theater has put in place. And I don't see that. That's why I try and rail against that as much as is humanly possible, because to think that, and the main conversation you should always be having with yourself is, maybe I'm not one of the good guys. Maybe I'm one of the bad guys. And that's a conversation that conservatives feel like they have to have with themselves constantly, every fucking day. And that same conversation does not happen on the left. You're either with us or against us. For a side that talks about non-binary thinking, you sure love to shove people into binary thought processes. They're bad. I'm not one of them. So by definition, I have to be good. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily related to this particular situation, but some elements that are presented can absolutely be attributed to this particular situation. And you can talk about religion and the way that people operate in society all day, but if you don't talk about the other side in that same capacity and their fundamental ability to change or not change, you're only having half of the conversation. And we need to have more of that conversation, because neither side is necessarily right in this I'm gonna say situation again. I really wish I had a beer to drink with that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So okay, wait, Nick. I want to get clear on this.
Yeah.
Are you saying that conservatives are doing this soul searching where they're asking, am I really the good guy or not? And that people on the left are not doing that?
No, I'm not saying that they're not. I'm saying that it seems to be that there's a wider conversation. How do I do this?
Because I know a lot of dogmatists on the right.
Oh,
too,
absolutely.
is all I'm saying,
No.
right?
I'm saying that the conversation isn't presented out there like that conversation is happening, or that there's a more nuanced conversation happening on the left outside of these major events. Which everybody is having to wrestle with this particular situation. But like every time we talk, every single conversation that we have, I have to think about what my perspective is and how it fits with the worldview that you guys are going to put out there. Because generally, we're not in lockstep on a lot of stuff. And that's fine. I'm happy to do that. From a political perspective, you should be doing that. And you should question everything. The same way that you should question everything from a societal standpoint when you're talking about religion and how you fit into that mix. It just seems like the conversation is regularly that conservative Christians need to wrestle with this conversation more than progressives and liberals do in just kind of an overarch, and we're talking about society in general.
And as a theologian, I don't necessarily interpret. So, I think there's different kinds of conservatism, I guess, from my perspective, right? There are some forms of like biblicism. There are some hermeneutic approaches to the Bible, for example, versus hermeneutic approaches to the authority of tradition, and those do not easily map onto conservative social positions versus liberal social positions, that sort of thing, right? So I wouldn't necessarily say that, and certainly. So anyway, when I talk about like progressive, I wouldn't necessarily even mean progressive, like when I'm thinking about Christians and the way that they interpret the Bible, it's just a different conversation. It's
Sure.
not liberal conservative. It has to do with like, what is text and how do you approach the text?
Sure.
And how does your tradition reflect or how does your denomination reflect the broader Christian tradition, that sort of thing. But I agree. In my church, it's just very like, well, we're progressive, so we're Democrats, and
right.
So we're whatever. And I'm Canadian, so I'm neither of those parties. I'm not allowed to vote. Don't worry if I've said anything that's too radical or leftist. They don't let me vote anyway, so it's no big deal. Anyway, sorry, Phil, I was interrupting you.
No, I was just gonna say that I don't think like when I'm talking about how as evangelicals have sort of attained this position of power, it brings these challenges along. I'm not necessarily saying that they should be questioning this and the left isn't. I think it's just the nature of the situation they're in when they find themselves in power that it raises these sorts of questions. And I think the left has the same thing going on. I don't think we're claiming that the left doesn't. Right? We just went through a primary in which you had the Bernie Sanders wing and the more moderate wing debating about what the party should stand for and where it should stand for. I don't think either of them is monolithic or not questioning things.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it also comes back to power, too. When you look historically at the United States, it is Protestants, not necessarily saying Democrat or Republican, but Protestants have controlled the political discourse here. So, I think that's where that some of that pushback comes from. If you've been in power and you're controlling the system, you have more to answer for than if you're on the margins and you're on the outside. So, but again, yeah, everybody needs to have some soul searching in all of this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Oh God, this is really deep.
This is great. We talked Jesus. We talked politics. I'm very happy.
Justin, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, you guys. This was great.
Anything else we need to go over, guys?
No.
No.
Next week I'm good. Be better, right? The world has to be better next week, right?
Oh, my sweet summer child. No, it doesn't. Well, yeah. Thank you guys for joining us. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Live shows every Wednesday, probably around 4:30. Merch line, podcast, all that fun stuff. Look it up. I'm too tired to give you the specifics. And then I hope it's better next week, but we will certainly be talking about it. So we will see you guys then. Thank you again, Justin.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Cheers.